Welcome back, my beautiful human beings, to my channel. Today we're going to do a little video on some whack-ass stuff that women in the Middle Ages had to go through. Because, you know, being a woman is hard in the modern day, let alone being a woman in the medieval times when living was a trial. So yeah, we're gonna do like a list of 10 messed up things that medieval women had to go through. Primarily, we're going to be talking about Europe because, you know, our written history is pretty Eurocentric, and there's just so much messed up stuff worldwide that I probably needed to do a separate video outside this one. So, as per usual, if you enjoy my videos, I would love it if you could like and subscribe. Anyway, let's get into the video. We're going to talk about the ideology of women being the original sin creators, like the Adam and Eve. And if you're not familiar, in Christianity there is the origin story of Adam and Eve who lived in a garden, and then God basically said to Adam, do not eat this fruit, and then Eve ate it and said to Adam, hey, have this so that we can then, you know, have babies and stuff, because otherwise I'm gonna get kicked out and you're not. So as the Catholic Church was the predominant power in the medieval ages in Europe, this story took on kind of a life of its own, and essentially it then became quite commonly taught that Eve tricked Adam into this original sin. Basically, that gave the leaders and the males of the time the excuse to see women as temptresses, and that they were then inferior to men because they succumbed to the temptation first. So that was kind of like the number one sucky thing, is that at the very root of the primary ideation at the time, women were not seen as equal. I mean, arguably, this is not just a medieval ages thing, but anyway, that's number one. Two was pregnancy and labor, childbirth, as an all-round concept. I don't know if you've ever been pregnant before, but it is freaking awful. And that's pregnancy in the modern day. I'm sorry, but people who say that they love their pregnancy, all of it, even the vomiting for 3 months, even the being so uncomfortable that you can't breathe, and like being woken up by being kicked from the inside in the top of your ribs, like. Anyway, the point is that when you are pregnant, your immune system is not the best. You kind of catch colds more easily because your body is busy literally growing a human being. Transport us back to medieval times where there was not that great of an understanding of germs. Well, when I say not that great, I mean like there was no understanding of germs, and hygiene was not as understood, even practiced back then. Fatality of a pregnant woman happened quite often, let alone childbirth, which is extremely dangerous. Mortality rate from childbirth was not good back in the medieval ages. Very mild complications today, such as a baby being breech or transverse. One of my babies was transverse, and let me tell you, that was uncomfortable. Could be the cause of death back then. Just a simple complication as not being in the right position, which happens all the time. A lot of women died in childbirth, and the cesarean section was actually performed back then, believe it or not. However, it was at the cost of either the mother or the baby. Usually the mother had died in childbirth before the baby was then removed from the mother, and the baby was not always able to live after the procedure. as the mother passes away, then oxygen levels are obviously cut off to the baby at some point. Let alone the fact that if a woman couldn't breastfeed their baby, then there was not a great way of feeding children back then. They fed them usually either from wet nurses, which the like higher class noble people used a wet nurse. That was a good way of feeding another baby that didn't have a mother that could breastfeed. But other than that, animal milk was sometimes used. It was basically like bread, like mushed up, which like giving to a newborn like obviously wasn't great. If you made it to year 1 of birth, like of your infant life, you got to your first birthday, it was a huge deal. If you got to your 7th birthday, it was a huge deal, because children in that first year of life often died. That's why the average lifespan of the Middle Ages was so low, because of the high mortality rate of infants. It like brings the average so much lower, to like, I think around like 30 years old. Crazy. But yeah, childbirth was super dangerous back in the day. And if it wasn't for modern medicine, it would still be just as dangerous. If it wasn't for modern medicine, I wouldn't be here, because I almost died in childbirth the first time round, and then I had a cesarean the second time round. So, you know. So that's number 2, just giving birth to children. Just giving birth. That's number 2, the insane experience of giving birth to children. Very hard in the medieval ages. So the third to carry on from this sort of topic is menstruation in the medieval times. Now, there isn't a ton of documentation around periods of this time due to social taboos, which is very sad, but anyway. But historians basically have concluded that most historical women would have used just rags to, you know, soak up the blood. There was a lot of religious shame around menstruation, which is wild, because every single childbearing woman had one every single month. Hello. What are you doing? So women went to insane lengths to hide the fact that they were menstruating from the general public. They would carry little pouches of sweet smelling stuff like frankincense or herbs or whatever around their waist, so it would neutralize the smell of blood. They also believed that burning a toad, like a frog, like a toad, and wearing pouches or like little bags of ashes would help with cramps. And we've really got it good in the modern days. I just like take a little cramp tablet. They had to burn a toad. Later on, past this period of time, would come in like these belt contraptions. In the Middle Ages, like underwear wasn't even really worn like we have it today. Like undies weren't really worn back then. 4th on the list would have to be the later medieval ages bedding rituals. Essentially, the tradition was that marriage was a holy sacrament, and to be complete, it must be consummated. So traditionally, there's been like a lot of different cultures that practice bedding ceremonies. Typically it's having like friends or family put them in the bed, and like that's as far as it kind of goes. But you know, sometimes at weddings people do like the garter thing, and that's where all of that kind of originates from. But in England in the medieval ages, the actual consummation act, the intercourse, was viewed. So the process usually started by a priest blessing the bed. Then the newlyweds prepared themselves, obviously taking off the elaborate wedding clothing and getting down to their underclothes. And they would drink sweet and spicy wine. So the groomsmen and the bridesmaids would essentially take various sides on the bed, sit themselves down, and then threw the couple's stockings at them. A hit was believed to indicate that the thrower would soon marry. So if they threw their stocking and it hit them, yeah, you get it. Finally, the curtains were drawn around the bed and the couple was left to do their thing. Typically, if it was like a notable marriage or like royalty was involved, proof of the consummation was required. King Charles I of England was a nobility who refused to participate in this ritual, and he barred the doors. It was like a big scandal. But women in England had to put up with this. Like, imagine your first time, which, let's be real, even at the best of times, it's probably not the best of times. It's awkward. Let's for argument's sake say that it could be the male's first time too. And then knowing that there was like a room full of people on the other side of a curtain, making sure it happens. Like the poor women. List was dowries. Dowries are such an uncomfortable tradition. They're really ugh. Anyway, what was a dowry? A dowry was essentially a sum of money or assets that was paid to the groom when he took a particular woman as a wife. So it was supposed to like entice the man to take the wife because he would get a big lump sum of money. I'm putting it on the list because like, ew. The next one is not just a crappy thing for women of the Middle Ages, but just people in general in the Middle Ages, and that is syphilis. Syphilis was a sexually transmitted disease and wasn't really understood that well in the 1400s. Basically was introduced to Europe by Charles Charles of France. He had a lot of numbers after his name. It didn't have the horrendous mortality rate of the bubonic plague. However, it was pretty awful and there is no cure. People were terrified and people were getting it because women would marry men who claimed to never have been with another woman. But of course, they indeed had, and they indeed carried syphilis. They may not have had symptoms, but they carried. And then the woman would, without consent, get syphilis, even though they had checked anyway. At the time, it was known as the Great Pox because that was some of the symptoms, was a pox on like the face and the nose area. Its symptoms were painful and repulsive. Genital sores, facial abscesses, and genital foul-smelling abscesses, ulcers over the whole body, and severe pain in the body. So many people were trying to work out how to get rid of syphilis and entered mercury. So, of course, people were dying of mercury poisoning just to try to get rid of it. Really crappy disease, but a lot of people had to deal with it. Next up is the ducking stool. This was a form of public humiliation that women would go through if they were found to be engaging in sexual activities. Men were punished as well, but if we know anything, if we're smart boys and girls, we know that women were very much punished for this more than men. The standard was higher. Basically, they were strapped to a chair outside of their home in street humiliation, and basically everyone in the town would take the day off work and make fun of the people in the stool. It's really shit. And then there was a stool where they would be like, the seat would be connected to the pole and then like dunked the dunking stool into the water just because somebody had sexual intercourse. So the next reason that it was rough for medieval women was that they could literally be tried as like a witch whenever someone felt like it. The idea is that they were gullible, so they turned to magic. Okay. Number 2 is that women are insatiable to their desires, which is very different to what the modern ideology of like women not being interested in their sensual desires. Back then, it was believed that women were insatiable. 3, because women like to talk with one another. They are very great at speaking, and they talk devil things. Honestly, I don't really have a better explanation for that. And number 4, women are obviously so physically and mentally weak that they have to use witch powers to be strong. Medieval ages, if you were a man and you had an affair, you would essentially pay a fine, and then you would go back to living your normal life like nothing happened. But if you were a woman, things were very different and much worse, obviously, because a woman was found to be participating in an affair, which happened quite often. Essentially, they would get their nose or their ears removed, cut off, removed from their face completely, to make them unattractive so that they wouldn't commit the crime. But men got off with a fine. The next on the list is getting married as a child, a literal child. At the age of 12, children were married to fully grown male adults. 12 years old. 12. I hadn't even gotten my first period at 12. I literally thought that the drummer from School of Rock was attractive at 12. I thought I wanted to be a drummer because I was in love with the kid from School of Rock. And there are women in the Middle Ages that got married at that age. Are you kidding me? The next on the list is getting married as a child. A literal child. At the age of 12, children were married to fully grown male adults. 12 years old. 12. I hadn't even gotten my first period at 12. I literally thought that the drummer from School of Rock was attractive at 12. I thought I wanted to be a drummer because I was in love with the kid from School of Rock. And there are women in the Middle Ages that got married at that age. The worst thing is that the parents instigated this. So the parents had chosen for the girl, prior to the marriage, that she would be married off to some man. A parent did that. Worst part about this entire thing is that under civil law in the medieval ages in Europe, Britain, England, whatever, a man was able to discipline his wife. Like literally, this was in the civil law. So men were able to hit their wives within reason and discipline them for being bad. I don't even know what to say to this. Like, my blood is boiling. Like, I would not have survived in this time period. I would have literally stabbed 75 men. because this is freaking disgusting. They were able to discipline their wives like children because they were children. So obviously there were a lot of wives that did not like this. They did not enjoy, they did not participate. They were about as angry as I am at the situation. And so they killed their husbands, because rightfully so. You know what I mean? Like, I get it, girl. I can relate. And then, if they killed their husbands, they would be subjected to burn at the stake, because it was a sin before God. If they were in an abusive relationship and they killed the husband, they were not protected by law. It was not self-defense. They would burn at the stake, which is a horrific death. Absolutely horrific death. Absolutely contrary to probably what you think. Being a lady of the night or in the sex trade was considered legal. It wasn't until many years later that being a professional sex worker was then deemed illegal. But in the medieval times, being a sex worker was absolutely legal and considered essential. Yeah, and they were regularly used, and it was fine. It was considered fine even for a married man to use sex workers to satiate his needs. Thank you for watching this infuriating video. I hope that you enjoyed the learning despite its disgustingness. I wish it didn't happen, but it did. And we can all learn a lot from this. Maybe some of these assholes that make these podcasts about how feminism isn't needed can maybe watch this video and learn a thing or two about why, yes, indeed, it does exist for a reason. Thank you. Please subscribe. Please like. Please click a bell. Please do something. If you enjoyed this video, if you learned something, I will forever be in your favor. I will love you and we will be best friends. Thank you and good night.